Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to our Curious Amalgam. My name is Kathleen, and today our topic is, does visual generative AI make better ads? Exploring AI advertising effectiveness. Generative AI has emerged as a powerful tool with a broad range of personal and commercial applications. Businesses are increasingly considering the use of generative AI for work that historically relied on human creativity, including in the area of marketing and advertising. On this episode of our Curious Amalgam, we explore a question of key interest to business leaders and regulators. How do consumers respond to advertisements made with generative AI? And can these ads really be more effective than human-generated ads? Joining me today is my co-host, Jaclyn Phillips. Hi, Jaclyn.
Hi, Kathleen.
And Jaclyn, could you introduce our guest today?
Yeah, for sure. Our guest today is Professor Vilma Todri, who is an Associate Professor of Information Systems at Goizueta Business School of Emory University. Her research focuses on topics like firm strategy and consumer behavior in digital environments such as social media networks, commerce, and other digital platforms. Particularly relevant for today's discussion, she studies the impact of technologies like AI and machine learning. She and co-authors recently released a paper titled The Impact of Visual Generative AI on Advertising Effectiveness. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Todri.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
So to get started with this topic, as I think all our listeners will know and hear about, Gen AI is something that comes up in many, many industries right now. Can you explain how you are seeing generative AI being used in advertising?
Yeah, for sure. There's been a lot of interest about generative and AI and its capabilities. And it's been actually one of the fastest adopted technologies in marketing and advertising in general. So it's transforming advertising in many significant ways. But if we were to focus on content creation and creative advertisements, there are two significant ways in which Gen AI is currently being used in the industry. One is editing some existing ad creatives. For example, there might be creatives that a creative team has traditionally generated, and we might feed those into a Gen AI system and ask the system to edit or improve them in certain ways. Or alternatively, we can use Gen AI systems to essentially create advertisements from scratch. We might, for example, prompt the AI system with a description of the brand and the product and ask it to have a holistic creation of the advertisements themselves.
You mentioned Gen AI modified ads and Gen AI created ads. Why is that distinction important?
So that's a really good question. It is important because essentially it comes down to how much creativity, freedom of creativity we give to the AI system. In one context, when we say we create the advertisements from scratch, essentially we give a prompt, a description of the product and the brand. We let the AI system completely envision how the ad will look like. We don't provide any visual reference, and we don't really provide much of constraints. So essentially the output, the system is free to think holistically and envision an ad from scratch. Whereas in the other mode, we might say, we provide a clear visual reference, right? This is an existing ad that has been created by human experts, and essentially the system is restricted in many ways. So the level of freedom for creativity is lower in this case, because essentially the system has to maintain a lot of the original ad and make some perhaps local edits. So this is one of the reasons we have to distinguish between these different uses.
And going back to how Gen AI is being used, is speed kind of a motivating factor behind using Gen AI? Sort of how is Gen AI impacting the production of these ads and how these firms are creating them?
That's a great point. Speed indeed is one of the bottlenecks we've traditionally had with the process of how essentially advertisements have been traditionally generated. The reason is that it's expensive to have a creative team to create advertisements, and if we have like a large team, that it can be cost prohibitive, or it can take a lot of time to create these advertisements. However, things completely change with the invention of generative AI, because it does allow us to create in a very cost efficient way and a very fast, a large number of advertisements. And essentially now the bottleneck becomes not creating the advertisements themselves, but essentially, testing and ensuring they are on brand and so on.
Got it. And we see Gen AI being used in a lot of industries, and speed may be a factor, but as lawyers will know, speed of finding information for your profession may not always lead to the best outcomes. With lawyers, the big issue is accuracy. So thinking about Gen AI and advertising, what motivated you to study the impacts that visual Gen AI is having on advertising effectiveness?
That's a very good point. Indeed, speed is not the only factor that should matter, and we care a lot about what is the actual effect on how consumers perceive the ads and what the actual effectiveness, how does it compare to the advertisements, for example, that human experts create. So essentially, Gen AI adoption is exploding, but there wasn't much evidence whether visual Gen AI improves ad performance. And noticing this gap and naturally being interesting in these type of questions, like how technologies impact users and firms, this became a topic of interest. And there is a real debate. Some people in the industry believe that creativity is uniquely human, whereas others believe that AI is capable of creating creative outputs. So essentially, this sort of motivated the set of questions we pursue in this paper.
In your most recent study, what were the specific questions that you were trying to answer?
Yeah, so with this motivation in mind, we essentially pursue 4 key research questions. Based on the different modes that we can leverage Gen AI systems on, we try to understand first whether Gen AI, what we call modified ads, outperform original human expert ads. So we can think of the Gen AI modified ads as advertisements that the Gen AI creates when it has as a visual reference original human expert ads. So in other words, we might essentially feed to the Gen AI system a human expert ad, and we ask it essentially to either improve it in whatever way it thinks it's appropriate, or improve it by applying a specific style. So this is the first research question. And then for the second research question, we let the AI system have a higher degree of freedom. Essentially, we don't provide a visual reference. We don't provide a human expert ad as an input. We do provide a prompt that describes the brand, describes the product, so that it has a good understanding what the target audience is. And then the system generates the ads from scratch. So that is the second research question then is, do these, what we call Gen AI created ads, do they outperform Gen AI edited and the human expert ads? And then to further test this idea of freedom of creativity that the Gen AI system has, we relax the product packaging. So essentially, we let the Gen AI system even design the product packaging for the product. And the third resist question is essentially when we let the Gen AI completely think of not just the ad, but the product package as well, does that affect the performance of the advertisements? And last but not least, being motivated by, there's been a lot of discussion about having mandatory disclosures of AI involvement in different processes and products. And so this motivated our last question, which is whether essentially the disclosure of AI involvement in the creation of the ad or editing the ad had an impact on advertising effectiveness.
Before we get into the specifics of what you found, could you tell us a little bit about the process that you use to go about answering these questions and what kind of economic methods you use in your studies?
Yeah, that's really important because essentially we do our best to provide an answer that is robust across different factors. So in this paper, we use what we would call a mixed method approach so that we can triangulate, and essentially by combining different methods, we can leverage the advantages these methods have to provide a more robust set of results. So first, we built a different ad variants. I think I already mentioned in the context of the research questions, like how we go about doing that. For Gen AI edited ads, we have as an input human expert ads. For the Gen AI created ads, we only provide a description of the brand and the product. And then we take this set of ads, we have the human expert ads, we have the Gen AI edited ads, and then we have the Gen AI created ads, right? 3 different categories. And then we take these ads, and the first thing we do is we conduct what we call a lab experiment. So in a control environment, we can essentially present these advertisements to participants and see how they react, how they respond to these advertisements, what they think of them. And the great thing about the lab experiment, it can be, if carefully designed, it can be a great, essentially, method to alleviate concern about many other alternative factors that could affect how consumers perceive the ads. But also, it's a great method to trying to better understand later on why consumers react in this way. So, for example, we try to better understand why consumers react positively or negatively to certain types of ads. That means essentially that it does allow us to better deep dive into what we would call mechanism behind these effects. And in addition to the lab experiment, we also conduct what we call a field study, where we take these ads as essentially test them in a real ad environment. So we use the Google Display Network to essentially run campaigns in the real world, and we observe the actual response of consumers. We observe real world click-through rate and how consumers perceive these advertisements.
So based on these pretty robust methods that you use to really take a careful look at these issues, what did you find about whether visual Gen AI creates more effective advertisements?
I think the findings might surprise you, as they have surprised quite a few practitioners in the industry as well. The first main finding is that Gen AI created ads. So these are ads that the Gen AI system creates from scratch without a reference to a visual output, just a description of the product and the brand. So Gen AI created ads consistently outperform both human expert ads and Gen AI modified ads. So in other words, it is better when we want to leverage Gen AI system to essentially give it the creative freedom to create these advertisements from scratch. So that is the first key finding we have. In the field study, these Gen AI created ads increased click-through rate by about 19% relative to the human expert baseline. So that's a pretty significant increase to achieve. And then with regards to the Gen AI modified ads, so these are the ads that the Gen AI system modify essentially by starting from a human expert ad and editing that in some structured or unstructured way. These Gen AI modified ads essentially didn't improve performance. Sometimes they were as effective as human expert ads, but other times were less effective than human expert ads. And the third research question, with regards to the third research question, when we let the Gen AI system also envision the product packaging, which responds to a lower level of constraints for creative output, then the performance is further improved. So, I think in a nutshell, we can describe these findings by saying that Gen AI created ads outperform the rest type of ads. And it is important that when we evolve Gen AI systems and technologies to create ads, we sort of do that without providing a lot of constraints, because that seems to be the optimal way to leverage the system and technology. And then we dive a little bit into the potential mechanisms to understand why do we observe these effects. For example, why Gen AI created ads outperform human expert ads or Gen AI modified ads. And the results indicate there it's not just about novelty. It's not that just about that these ads are more novel compared to human expert ads. It has a lot to do with what we call essentially emotional engagement, the ability of these advertisements to elicit positive emotion and engage consumers emotionally. But also these ads are rated by consumers as being easier to process and understand. So they have what we would call a higher processing fluency, which therefore would explain why they are more impactful as a result.
Yeah. That is, speaking of emotions, I don't know how we should feel about AI being able to better emotionally engage viewers of ads than other humans. But I don't know what that means for us. But anyway, outside the scope of your research, maybe.
I think it comes down to, having the AI system picking up some patterns in the data that perhaps go beyond what, like stylistic rules. Like if you learn to design an ad, there's certain principles that you can learn about what makes the ad beautiful, right? But you don't necessarily perhaps focus on, making this emotionally compelling. And I think it seems that the Gen AI system is able to pick up some of these patterns from being trained on this vast amount of unstructured data.
So you mentioned that you also looked at the impact of disclosing to consumers that an ad was made using AI. Did you find that disclosure made a difference in how they reacted to the ad?
Yeah, I think that's another interesting and perhaps unexpected finding of the paper. We find essentially there is a measurable trade-off between transparency and user engagement. So what that really means is that when we disclose the AI involvement, the advertising effectiveness dropped significantly. And we find this across both the field study and the lab experiment results. And the disclosure of AI involvement was associated with, for example, up to a 31% reduction in click-through rates compared to human expert advertisements. And the other interesting thing is that this applies both to Gen AI created ads as well as Gen AI modified ads. So it's across the board. There is like a negative penalty for disclosing AI involvement. And thinking about this is like, it's not that the ads themselves had an impact, right? Because we could test the same Gen AI created ads without disclosure and with disclosure. We see the negative effect when we actually disclose it. When consumers don't know that this has been created from a Gen AI system, then there's no negative penalty. So that seems to indicate that there's not something about the advertisements themselves or the content creation, but it's like how actually users perceive them and how they react to the involvement of the advertisement. And the other interesting thing is that we do rule out the potential effect of using a specific wording that might have created this negative impact. So this actual finding is across the different variations of involvement, right? You can say AI edited, AI optimized, and so on and so forth. So across the board, there was a persistent negative effect of AI involvement.
It's really interesting. We know that from your research that people are engaging more with these advertisements, but there is some hesitancy to want to see AI generated content there. So we've seen this in, I think, discussions among government regulation for AI labeling. What implications, if any, do you think your research has on those discussions and the impact that mandatory labeling might have?
I think this was our motivation as well. We've kept up with the current discussion, the push for mandatory AI labeling. And we thought, okay, what happens when we actually have to disclose the involvement of the Gen AI? And the evidence suggests that you should, expect a performance cost, at least for now. At least in the current environment, it does seem that disclosing the AI involvement has a negative effect. Perhaps consumers, are skeptical to the Gen AI or the AI system designing the ads with the intention of influencing them. But this does create, in my view, a clear policy tension because, on the one hand, transparency can help protect consumers and consumer ethics. But on the other hand, here we find that it does reduce the effectiveness, and it's not coming from the ad content itself, it's coming from the simple disclosure. So I think it's really important for both regulators and platforms to think carefully about this negative cost and what it actually means in practice, and if for disclosure to be implemented and to become mandatory, I think further research would be beneficial. So this is one of the motivations for a follow-up research project we have, where we're trying to understand what is actually driving this negative effect associated with disclosure of AI involvement, and what would be some of the factors that could mitigate this negative effect. And for marketers, of course, it means that if mandatory becomes, if disclosure becomes mandatory, it is critical to better understand what essentially other factors could affect ad engagement while complying with mandatory requirements of disclosure.
Well, thank you very much for coming to discuss your research with us today, Professor Todri. For our listeners, we will link the paper that we discussed here in the show notes for the episode. So, Professor Todri, before we end the episode, we also always have a segment at the end about getting to know you a little bit better. So, first off, can you tell us about something interesting or unusual about yourself that people who only know you in a professional setting might not know?
I don't know if it's unusual, but I'm a big tech enthusiast. And a lot of the questions I pursue academically and in my research are things from my own, personal life. Like, I love testing new technologies. I love experiencing new technology myself. And a lot of the questions come either from the excitement I have myself from testing these technologies, or from frustration I might feel from experiencing these technologies. So, if I weren't a professor, I think I would have, I would work on something very related still to tech products.
Yeah, that sounds like a great source of inspiration.
Yes, absolutely it is.
Definitely. And before we let you go, we'll do our last segment, the Curious Hat.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
So, I will give you sort of an option for this question. Tell us about either the best vacation location that you've been on, or what your dream vacation location is.
Have a long list for my dream vacation. So I think I'll have a difficult time choosing. It keeps getting longer and longer. But the first thing that came to my mind when you said, tell us about your best vacation, that was last summer. I spent a week or so in Milos, Greece. So Milos is an island in the Cyclades cluster of islands in Greece. And I'm biased here because I am from Greece, but that was by far the best vacation I've ever had. It's such a beautiful island, and I feel it's not as popular as some of the other islands in Greece yet. And it's like a well-kept secret that, hopefully it will remain like that for the next few years. So it combines several things. Like the food is great, if you're a beach person, they have beautiful landscapes. So there's lots of things to do.
Well, now that you've given up that secret on our Curious Amalgam, there might be a huge influx of antitrust and consumer protection enthusiasts on that island. So I don't know. We'll have to see if it remains a well-kept secret.
I'm from Greece. I'm okay with that. The more people come against Greece, I think the better off we are.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll all enjoy reading and kind of thinking more about the implications of your paper, and I'm sure there will be more to come as AI continues to become intertwined in our daily lives. So to all our listeners, we'll see you next time on our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.